reunification, and pretty much we're doing it all at this point. So we focus primarily on areas of family reunification and humanitarian law, and then we have a big citizenship practice, so helping people who have already gone through the process of getting their residency to then become citizens. And then we do a lot of document renewal as well to make sure that people are staying in status and can continue to work and remain here without fear of deportation or anything like that. So just to jump in today's Know Your Rights presentation, want to kind of set some foundations for us. So as someone who's worked in this field since 2011, I've had opportunity to kind of like watch the shifting landscape and observe, the general populace divide and separate into different islands, ideological islands. And I feel kind of fortunate that I've been able to do this work and observe in the way that I have. And I feel like, we've had the unique ability to be bridge builders during this time to help people kind of see how this really doesn't need to be a partisan issue. But what I hear both sides of the political spectrum talking about all the time is safety, empowerment, and then accountability. And whether it's folks who feel like our communities are unsafe because of MS-13 or, this invasion of immigrants, or it's communities of immigrants who feel unsafe because they're being faced with the threat of deportation, the common value is safety. We as human beings want to feel safe and secure in our homes and our communities. And then empowerment, I hear this a lot too, feeling like we don't have access to information. We don't understand what's going on. We feel like we can't make informed decisions for ourselves because, our elected representatives are withholding information, or, we're getting disinformation or misinformation through news sources. And so empowerment seems to be a big value theme that is recurring over the last many years. And then finally, wanting to be able to hold government officials and elected individuals accountable. Once we do have that knowledge and we're able to make informed decisions for ourselves, we then want to hold someone accountable. Once you want everybody to play by those rules. And so everybody is kind of saying the same thing. And so the reason I like to start this presentation with a review of these values is so that we can see those bridges that still exist, the commonalities between folks of differing ideologies, and understand that as human beings, we all have very similar values, but how we approach those values and think about them may differ. But what we're going to talk about today is valuable to everyone, regardless of immigration status. Everyone should know what their civil rights are. Everyone should know how to hold law enforcement agencies, whether it's a civil law enforcement or criminal law enforcement agency, accountable. So by learning about this, we then are able to act on that information and keep ourselves safe, or at least preserve those rights, and then help to preserve the rights of our community. More specifically, though, why this matters, it can help to prevent unnecessary arrests. And that issue of accountability, we can hold the government accountable for violations of our constitutional rights. And then we can also inform people of their rights and help them to navigate and anticipate risks. In the context of today's presentation, where I'm talking to a group of faith leaders, this is really important. We want to have the ability to advocate on behalf of our congregants and provide them with this information. And if our sacred spaces of worship are violated by immigration enforcement agents, at least we have this information that we can offer in those situations. And then finally, empowering people, whether it's us as concerned community members or people who may actually be affected by enforcement action, to advocate for themselves and other people. And then just a roadmap so that we can kind of follow along as we go through today's presentation. We're going to start with just a basic review of the Fourth Amendment and talking about what constitutional rights everyone has. There's a lot of this information out there right now about what rights specifically apply to which person. And then we're going to talk about police question marks. So identifying what what is actually a police officer and what's an administrative law agent or officer. We're going to talk about warrants. This is something that comes out a lot when we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, and we're going to look at the distinction between two types of warrants. Then we're going to talk about civil rights basics. So I will talk about this as if it's the little black dress, or for the guys in the audience, your basic black suit. And then depending on the occasion, you accessorize those basic civil rights for that. Then we're going to talk about border zone. A lot of people don't realize that the entire state of Michigan is in a border zone, and then this impacts, as a result, our basic constitutional rights. We're going to review specific scenarios where, again, this is where we accessorize those basic civil rights. And so we're going to look at some specific scenarios and how those civil rights might need to be dressed up or dressed down. And then I wanted to talk specifically about safety planning in places of worship. So I wanted to help the people in the audience today start thinking about what can be done to probably not prevent ICE from coming to places of worship, but what we can do proactively to protect the people in our congregations. So this surprises many people when I tell them, but everyone has constitutional rights. So everyone has the right to due process or their day in court. Everyone has the right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures, and the right to legal counsel. So even if we're talking about civil immigration proceedings, you have the right to request an attorney. And even more so in criminal proceedings, you have the right to a free attorney, which is not guaranteed in immigration proceedings. You also have the right to remain silent, which is related to this right to not self-incriminate, to not say anything that might be held against you. You also have the right to a jury trial in criminal proceedings, right to Miranda warnings. Remember, like anybody who watches any sort of crime dramas, you have the right to remain silent, and then they go through that whole spiel. And you also have a right to those Miranda warnings in a language that you understand. You have the right to defend against deportation. So that's having your day in court or due process in the immigration court. Right to file civil suit. So if you were wronged and you want to file a tort claim, you have the right to do that, no matter what your immigration status is. Right for payment for work, right to safe and healthy work environment, right to primary education. Again, when we're talking about, especially the undocumented population, we tend to think or assume they don't have a lot of rights in this country. But at this point, there are very little constitutional rights that don't broadly apply to everyone, regardless of immigration status. They don't have the right to vote. And I'm trying to think of what other rights wouldn't apply, but I'm running into a blank wall here. But for the most part, like, this is a pretty comprehensive list. And there are a lot of things that protect folks in this country, regardless of immigration status. So the Fourth Amendment, the reason this is important, and it can take different shapes, is because it's based on this concept of reasonable expectation of privacy. So not in every scenario do you have complete expectation of privacy as you might in your home. There are varying degrees of expectation of privacy depending on where you're at. If you're in a public park, for example, there's no expectation of privacy. But if you're at a church, for example, where there's a public worship service going on, you're going to have a diminished expectation of privacy because it's a public worship service. So unless you're in a zone of the church that's identified as private, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Same with the workplace. There's certain places in our offices and stores that are deemed private, where you'll see like a staff only sign or private, no admission. And so those are spaces where there is an expectation of privacy. But if you're in like the lobby area, or I don't know, like thinking about McDonald's or the grocery store, if you're out in one of those areas where everyone's allowed to be, then assume there's no expectation of privacy, but then there are different rights that you can invoke in those situations. So more specifically, the Fourth Amendment as it relates to immigration is an important distinction. So when we're talking about immigration with a capital I, we're generally referring to the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. And then sometimes when we're broadly talking about immigration processes, we're talking about also the Department of Justice and the Department of State. Those are the three principal agencies that kind of influence and process immigration benefits. Under the Department of Homeland Security, and mind you, Department of Homeland Security wasn't created until 2003 under the Bush administration, post 9/11. So it's a relatively new agency. And then ICE didn't exist until the Department of Homeland Security was created by legislation. So there's ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and then CBP, the Customs and Border Protection. These are the two agencies under DHS who can arrest people, whose job it is to detain people or enforce immigration policy. But importantly, the rules for immigration agents differ from the rules for who we traditionally think of as police. So our local police department, our county police department, state, or even FBI, the rules are vastly different for these agencies. And that is just because they are administrative agencies. So they are agencies created by legislation to enforce civil law, not criminal law. And so when I think about police, I think of my local police department who have gone through police academy and they have lots of training and their primary objective is public safety. ICE and CBP, though, their primary objectives are vastly different. And they would tell you that it's a matter of national security. And depending on which unit of ICE we're talking about, it's Homeland Security Investigations Unit. And but in reality, what they're really tasked with is administrative or civil law and like detention of individuals or just kind of keeping tabs on people who have been detained in the past. But the Fourth Amendment rights that we just talked about, they apply whether it's ICE or CBP or the police. So whether it's your local police department or one of these administrative agencies like ICE or CBP knocking on your door, you still have the same civil rights that we're going to talk about in just a minute. And then the Fourth Amendment, like I said, I just want to kind of beat this horse, is everyone has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So that's what the Fourth Amendment is driving at. But again, how much protection varies on the circumstances. And we're going to go into that point in more detail here in a minute. What do we do, though, if there was that reasonable expectation of privacy and then ICE or CBP violates it? So one reason it's important to know this information is because it can be helpful in an immigration case if there's a record of the violation. One distinction that my staff attorney, who normally co-presents with me, and I like to make is that when you're talking about civil proceedings, there's no exclusionary rule. And so I know this sounds like legal jargon and nonsensical speech to most of you, but what this means is even if evidence was unlawfully obtained, so they violated your rights, they broke down the door, they didn't have a warrant, and as a result, they not only apprehended the person they were after, but they also apprehended 6 other people who were in the house, and they didn't have a warrant to apprehend them, and they had no permission to be in the house. Even though they violated all those rights, but because we're talking about civil proceedings, that evidence cannot or will not be excluded. They can still use that in the deportation proceedings against those individuals that were apprehended unlawfully. Whereas if it was a situation of criminal proceedings, let's say it was a police officer who, again, no warrant and just broke down a door and arrests somebody and in the process finds, a bag of cocaine sitting on the table, because it was an unlawful entry and an unlawful arrest, that cocaine is then omitted from evidence because of the exclusionary rule. So it's just important to keep all of this in mind, because even though we're talking about depriving someone of their freedom by detaining them or deporting them from the country, there are these different subset of rules that apply that are vastly different than criminal law when we're oftentimes depriving people of the same thing. So there's very different standards, even though oftentimes we're looking at the same consequences for folks. The other thing to keep in mind is if we're seeing ICE or CBP repeating these violations over and over again, there's a possibility that a court may say, okay, enough's enough. Like, we've got the Fourth Amendment for a reason, stop violating it. And so keeping records of all of these times or filing a lawsuit every time this happens is eventually going to catch up with them. And we're going to find a court that's going to say, stop doing this, guys. And then the last thing is that there are also political and social costs in raising awareness. So thinking about the case that recently hit the news with regard to the Quaker Church and the individual who was detained there, that blew up, and then there was a lawsuit as a result of that. But so we think about the fiscal costs of it. Okay, we file a lawsuit and that's expensive, and there's the legal costs, but then the political and social costs for doing those things very publicly can eventually start to wear down on these agencies and act as a deterrent to this sort of inappropriate behavior. And again, the more we see this happening and the more we're educated about these rights, the more we're going to be empowered to stand up against these violations. So I mentioned that ICE and CBP are not police in the traditional sense. They are administrative agencies enforcing civil law, not criminal law. And ICE, like other law enforcement agencies, can lie to get your consent. So what we see happen often with ICE is that they will knock on a door and say, open up, police, but they won't identify specifically that they are ICE. That in and of itself doesn't indicate that there's been a violation of someone's Fourth Amendment right. They can lie, just like police officers can lie in order to get someone to say something under oath that they want them to say, or get someone to open a door or whatever. ICE will, like I said, often pretend to be the police. We've also heard of them pretending to be like FBI or IRS, and they'll just, like I said, knock, 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 police, open up. And I don't know about you, but for me, when police are knocking at my door, I sure as heck am going to open that door. And it's happened a number of times in my neighborhood where they've knocked on my door. And even as an attorney who's been giving these presentations for years, I unthinkingly open that door because I want to be a good citizen. And so ICE will oftentimes, kind of take advantage of that instinct to cooperate with police. And then they will often wait for you to open the door and then just step inside. They'll treat that as an invitation, or they'll wait for kids to open the door and let them in. And then oftentimes, like this has happened actually here on the west side of the state in Holland, they break down doors even if they don't have valid warrants. And again, we're going to talk about warrants in a minute. But I want everyone to take away from this that ICE can only enter a home or even a place of business when they have a valid judicial warrant or someone has given consent for them to enter. And I will say they almost never have a proper judicial warrant. And so how they often get into homes is either through consent or force. And so what we want the general public to know, and we've vetted this with the State Bar Ethics Committee, that it is okay for us to give this advice. Don't give consent to enter the home. There's no law that obligates you to cooperate with ICE or even law enforcement. If they have a proper warrant to get into your home, they will get into your home. And one thing that like my staff attorney and I often talk about is being able to preserve your ability to fight this in court or bring this up as like a social or political cost through like releasing it to the media is worth the price of a door. Let them break down your door so that you, again, make sure that you have not given consent and we've preserved evidence that they did violate your Fourth Amendment rights. So judicial warrants. Oftentimes, what we're finding is, and again, been doing this work for almost 14 years, and this is just a pattern of behavior that these guys engage in, where they will say they have a warrant, but they don't actually have what's called a judicial warrant. And so judicial warrants are something that have been presented to a judge or magistrate, and the judge or magistrate has reviewed evidence to determine that probable cause, so this burden of proof has been established, and then they'll sign off on it. And those warrants in particular are time limited. And so on this next, oh shoot, that's not really helpful. So on this slide, there was supposed to be two different warrants, and one of them is the traditional legally binding warrant issued by a judge or a magistrate. And so what this one will often say is at the top, it'll identify the name of the court. So like United States District Court of Michigan. And then below that, it'll identify a case number, and it'll also say what kind of warrant it is. Like it's a search and seizure warrant, or it's an arrest warrant like you see up on the screen here. Actually, this is a picture of an arrest warrant up on the screen, so that at least can be helpful. Also, like I said, it's very specific in the date and time that it can be enforced. And so it's time limited. It's not like indefinitely into perpetuity you can look for this person. It's very limited. And then it's actually signed by a judge. Whereas the administrative warrants identify that it's the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So at the top, you'll see U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and then next to it, you'll see warrant for arrest of alien. That's how you know straight away that you're looking at an administrative warrant, which is non-binding. It is not the same as a judicial warrant. And you guys may be thinking like, why is she spending so much time talking to us about this? If you find yourselves in a situation as faith leaders, as people who are serving some leadership role in a place of worship, there's a possibility that ICE may come to your place of worship and present you with one of these documents. And so making sure that leadership knows the distinction between the two and can make an informed decision about whether or not to accept this as valid authority to allow this individual into the church to commit or to act on this warrant is really important. Like, we want you to be able to make those informed decisions, especially when the safety of your congregants is on the line. So in addition, these non-binding ICE warrants or administrative warrants, the authority is the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the piece of legislation that governs immigration law. So it's not a Department of Justice court. It is again this administrative agency. And then it's usually signed by an officer. So someone who works in the cubicle next to Jeff, you know, hey Bob, can you sign this administrative warrant? Sure, no problem. And so he walks out. And so the problem there is that no probable cause, like that burden of proof that we like to see before we're going to deprive someone of their freedom, hasn't been established. This is just someone who landed on someone's pile of case files on their desk, and now they've been tasked with detaining them, and they haven't actually presented it to a judge to get the proper sign off to conduct that arrest. So let's move on to the civil rights basics. So again, I likened this to, you know, for the ladies in the audience, this is our basic black dress. For guys, it's your basic black suit. Everyone's got one in their closet, and depending on the occasion, we're going to dress it up or dress it down. And so these 5 things up on the screen are things that we should always just have in mind when we're thinking about civil rights. And then we can dress them up or dress them down depending on what the occasion is or what scenario we're in. And we're going to talk through what this could look like in different scenarios. But to begin with, like I said, you always want to ask to see a warrant. What is your authority to conduct this arrest? And then just never consenting to a search or yeah, saying something like, I do not consent to you entering this property, or you do not have my permission to enter. And then never presenting fake documents. I know the tendency is when we're in a panic is to like run or lie or present fake documents. Those things can all land you in more trouble and create grounds for criminal charges. And we absolutely don't want to make more trouble. And then everyone has the right to remain silent, and everyone has the right to have someone recording, or they can be recording themselves using, a cell phone camera, as long as, like during a traffic stop, sometimes it can get tricky and an officer may claim, I don't feel safe because you're holding your phone. And that's where it can be helpful to have bystanders recording. But these are the basics that we want to keep in mind. And again, we may build on or take away depending on the scenario. We're going to talk about one scenario where rights may not look quite the same, and that's in our border zones. So the law behind this is questionable, is dubious. It's not really law at all. It was just it was a court opinion, and then someone just kind of arbitrarily said, okay, 100 miles within 100 miles of every border is the 100-mile border zone. And within these zones, CBP only needs reasonable suspicion, not probable cause. So it's like a lower burden of proof to conduct searches. And so your expectation of privacy in these border zones is diminished. So that's what I was talking about when you dress down or dress up those rights depending on context. Here we're addressing them down. So one great example are checkpoints in border zones. So checkpoints, they can be dropped within anywhere within these 100-mile border zones. For those of you who've been to Texas, they're really common down there. At checkpoints, everyone is stopped in their vehicle, and then CBP, Customs and Border Protection, can ask about someone's immigration status. They can demand documentation to verify that immigration status. And then they can also do kind of like an external inspection of the vehicle, but they can't, actually get into the car and like rifle through bags or anything, unless they have reasonable suspicion or evidence. Then they might be able to search your car's belongings, or within the car itself, like under the seats or in the trunk. And then if they have reasonable suspicion, they can keep you for an extended period. And they can ask questions that are unrelated to immigration status, like, I don't know, if they suspect that maybe you're transporting people unlawfully, or you might be engaged in trafficking. But over in this blue box here, I just want to point out that you still have the right to remain silent. And then we just basic reminders: don't flee, don't lie, don't present those false documents. Again, sometimes we're in a panic. We want to like do what we think is going to get us out of the situation. Especially when we're working with immigrant populations, there's sometimes these issues of just cultural differences. So I've lived in a few different countries, and it's different in other countries when you get pulled over by law enforcement. Sometimes you just throw a bill out the window and they're like, okay, see ya. And so a lot of folks coming into the United States from other countries sometimes come with that, cultural framework, that expectation that this is how you deal with traffic stops. And so one of the ways that we can serve people in our community is to help them understand that this is not what we do during a traffic stop. These are the expectations. And I just want to reiterate, there will be time for questions at the end. Delia wanted to do the recording without questions, and then that way that protects everyone's identity, and we'll stop the recording for questions. All right, so home sweet home. I think most of us understand that we have the highest expectation of privacy in our homes. And there's a saying that home is your castle, and there's case law to support this as well. So you'll notice that there seem to be a lot more do's and don'ts here than what were on the basic civil rights. And so this is where we're kind of dressing it up because we have maximum expectation of privacy in our homes. So one thing to keep in mind is if law enforcement of any shape or form comes to your door, don't open the door. You can ask for the warrant, so they can slide it under the door if possible, or they can hold it up to a window. You can also ask to see the badge. So again, you're asking for someone's identity and authority. And then by asking to see the badge, you'll be able to determine which law enforcement agency you're talking about. Because again, they'll often knock and say police or FBI, but until you confirm who they actually are, you don't know if they're lying. And so it'd be good to establish identity of that person. And then if even after they enter the house, or if they're still standing outside, just make sure that you clearly state you do not have my permission to enter. And this is okay to say, regardless of whether or not that they held up what you think is a valid judicial warrant. You can still say, you don't have my permission. You as a citizen, you as a non-citizen, you as an undocumented immigrant have the right to refuse to assist. You don't have to let someone into your home. Even if it's your workplace or your church, you don't have to be agreeable. You should be nice, you should be kind. You don't need to be aggressive or unkind in the way that you say these things, but you still have the right to refuse entry into these spaces where you have an expectation of privacy. Don't ever give consent to search. Don't give consent to enter. Don't give consent to search. And you don't have my permission to enter. You don't have my permission to search. And then ask to speak with your attorney, and then say nothing else. You, like I said, have that Fifth Amendment right to not self-incriminate, so not to say anything that might be held against you. And then you shouldn't show any ID from your country of origin. So let's say you have like a passport from Guatemala and you want to show it. Right there, what that does is that identifies you as a foreign national, and what that does is create that probable cause to conduct that arrest. And so ICE has to have probable cause in order to arrest someone. And so if you hold up that as your identity document, they're going to say, well, gee, you didn't hold up a Michigan driver's license, you didn't show me a US passport, so I can safely assume that you are not someone from this country and you don't have lawful immigration status, I'm going to arrest you. So it's a good idea just to refrain from showing an ID from your country of origin. In the workplace, there also is an expectation of privacy, but it differs slightly because of some of those things I mentioned earlier. There's certain spaces at your workplace where they are public. They're public spaces. I'm trying to think of, like, Gentex is the big factory in town. And then there's this big public lobby where you can walk into, but then there are additional spaces beyond that where it's clearly marked employees only, or unsafe, please keep out, because those are actually the factory floors. And so in those clearly marked spaces, there's an expectation of privacy, but where everyone, general public, can enter, there aren't like magnetically locked doors like at a school or something. There's no expectation of privacy. So just like in the home though, in order to conduct a search of a workplace, an ICE agent would need to have a warrant issued by a judge, or they would need your permission to enter. So your employer could give permission to enter, and that would give them the permission to be on the premises, even if they don't have a warrant. Employers also have the right to refuse in those situations, even when they are presented with a valid warrant. I want to reiterate over and over again, no one is under any obligation to comply with a law enforcement agent. If they've got a warrant, they're going to do what they're going to do. And if they don't have a warrant and they do it anyway, then you've preserved your right to file a civil suit against them. And then One important thing for employers to keep in mind, and this will be true of places of worship as well, clearly mark those public and private spaces. And it creates this expectation then of privacy that someone can see in the form of signage. So ICE, like I said, can enter those public spaces without a warrant, but they couldn't go into those places that are marked as private. And just in those other situations, during a search, everyone has the right to remain silent. They have the right to say or refuse the search. And then if it's a workplace, someone else could be like recording on their phone. Those recordings are really helpful. And like I said, they come with a social and political cost. And then that other reminder, don't present fake documents, don't run, and don't lie, because that opens the door to criminal charges. I want to go through a couple of what if situations based on these two scenarios we just talked about. So something that comes up frequently when we're talking about rights, apartment buildings. Let's say ICE shows up at an apartment building. They would have access to the public areas, so like lobbies and green spaces, but the same protections for your home would apply in an apartment. And what's important to know about apartments too is that landlords are not allowed to give ICE permission to enter an apartment without the renter's consent. So those same expectations of privacy apply in an apartment context. What about workplaces that are outdoors? We've got, at least in West Michigan, we've got tons of agricultural work happening, and then construction is huge throughout the state of Michigan. We all are familiar with the orange cones that seem to multiply like rabbits every summer. And so what about those people who are working in those situations? Again, ICE can access those open spaces, public streets, fields without a warrant. If there isn't a reasonable expectation of privacy because there isn't like a gate or a clearly marked barrier that says private employees only, then they're going to be able to access those spaces. They cannot access factory floors or private job sites not open to the public. So let's say you've got construction workers that are building a home on a lake. That would be considered a private job site that they wouldn't be able to enter. And again, things to just keep in mind, don't ever run and don't answer any questions. One way that they often get at people in these public spaces, we're going to talk about this in more detail, is by just kind of walking up to them and like, hey, Sarah, or hey, ma'am, care to answer a few questions? And a lot of times, you know, we're social beings and we're like, sure, what's up? And, you know, the second we start answering questions and providing information, suddenly that can be used against us. So that act of remaining silent is really important, but we're going to talk more about that situation in just a second. So traffic stops. ICE doesn't typically target people in public or in traffic stops unless it's someone that they've already identified and have an administrative warrant for. And again, that's not a legally binding warrant, but that's what they typically have that gives them the authority to start the process of searching for and detaining someone. We had this happen in Holland in September, where ICE had an administrative warrant for somebody and they did detain them in the car 2 blocks away from their workplace. So it is a possibility. And so it's important just to understand, again, what are your rights in this situation? Remaining calm is the most important thing. We see traffic stops go badly all the time when people panic. And then informing the officer, because you're in this tight space and they don't have like full visibility of your whole body. It's a really good idea to say, officer, I'm reaching into my glove compartment to get my driver's ID and insurance. May I do so? And then do it. And this is where at the bottom where it says you can record, where holding a phone may make an officer nervous. So it's a good idea to have one of those dashboard phone holders where you can clip it in, click the record button, and then hands on the steering wheel. My dad was a former police officer, and so when he was teaching me how to drive and was talking to me about the possibility of a traffic stop, he taught me always keep your hands on the driver's wheel and don't let go unless you've gotten permission from that officer to reach for something. I will never forget that lesson. But if you have a driver's license, you should present it, even if it's a driver's license from another country. Michigan is a state where we accept driver's licenses from countries that are on this list of treaty countries. And so as long as it's a driver's license that's unexpired and you have an English translation of the whole document, the law enforcement agent should accept it. And then Secretary of State has a really great resource that folks can keep in their glove compartment if they are using one of these foreign driver's licenses to drive around Michigan. Don't consent to a search of your vehicle. Same thing as at home. Don't present fake documents. Always do not present fake documents. Always can request the right to remain silent. Again, you can record and don't flee. The act of fleeing, lying, or presenting fake documents gives them more evidence to make that arrest or pursue criminal proceedings against you. So in public, this is something that has come up a lot. Just last week, I think it was, there were a lot of calls that we got and things popping up on social media about ICE and CBP and even the DEA being at like Walmart parking lots, and over on the east side of the state, they were at like ethnic grocery stores. And so what business, why would they be in public doing this? And I will say it's pretty rare. It's not like they're going to stand outside of a Walmart or a Mexican grocery store and just kind of pick people off, because they're going to run into some major civil rights complaints, because that looks a whole lot like racial profiling. So they will very rarely target people at random in public spaces. But if they do, they would have to have reason based on evidence. So they would have to have established probable cause in order to detain you. How do they get probable cause? Well, if you're giving them the information, if you're talking to them, if you're showing them documents, you're establishing probable cause. If they're simply detaining you in public because you were speaking Spanish or your skin is, darkly pigmented, that's not probable cause. That's not the same thing. So ICE and CBP, though, can approach anyone in the street or a parking lot or in a store and start asking questions. But you are under no obligation to answer any of those questions. And before you answer any questions, you should always ask, am I free to go? And if they say yes, say nothing else and walk away calmly. Again, don't run, because suddenly you might have created that probable cause. You might have given them evidence to question you further or detain you. But if they say no, you can ask for your attorney and then say nothing else. Do not run, don't resist arrest, don't lie or present false documents. I'm going to sound like a broken record for the rest of this presentation. So the next couple of scenarios I want to talk through relate to the sensitive locations memo that was just deleted, axed. I don't know what we want to say, done away with. So 2011, the Obama administration instituted the sensitive locations memo that stated that there were certain locations like schools and hospitals, medical facilities, places of worship, shelters, playgrounds. These were all considered sensitive locations where Immigration and Customs Enforcement could not conduct any business. They couldn't go into those places. Those were considered sacred spaces. So one of the first things that Mr. Trump did when he took office was do away with this memo. So no longer are schools, hospitals, medical facilities, places of worship, shelters, playgrounds, or other similar locations considered sensitive locations. And already we're starting to see immigration enforcement action happening in these sensitive spaces. What does that mean for us? I'm going to talk through some of the big ones. So schools. So very similar to some of the other scenarios we talked through, without a judicial warrant, which ICE or CBP rarely has, they can't enter a non-public area of a school without consent. And I will say, actually last week, Dilly had me speaking to the Michigan Department of Education and a bunch of administrators and educators. But most schools have already taken affirmative steps to think about what sort of policy they'd like to have in place with regard to ICE or CBP. And I guarantee all schools have visitor policies that apply to the general public. So for example, I have kids in middle and high school. When I want to go into that school, I can walk in through one set of doors, but I can't get past that second set of doors or even get into the office without first buzzing, and then they do a video, and sometimes I have to talk to somebody. And I think that's pretty standard protocol in this day and age of active shooters and whatnot. So pretty tight security in schools compared to when I was a little kid. So already some strict policies in place, but now they're starting to identify even stricter policies because teachers and administrators specifically have special duties to take precautions to protect their students. And so I'm really delighted to see that there are so many educators and administrators taking affirmative steps to protect students. Again, we are already seeing ICE step into these sensitive locations, and so making these plans is really important. And it's okay as people who are seeking to be empowered individuals who can hold our government officials accountable. It's okay to ask our schools, what is your policy? And those of us who are faith leaders, our congregants, should be asking these questions as well, now with the demise of that sensitive locations memo. So one important distinction, though, is most K through 12 campuses are called closed campuses, and it makes it much less accessible and therefore that higher expectation of privacy. And then colleges and universities are very different. A lot of them tend to be more open. I will say our local college here in Holland, you have to have a key card to get into a lot of the buildings. So there certainly is an expectation of privacy in those spaces, but just thinking through the different layout of these buildings is really important. And then one other thing to keep in mind is those drop-off and pickup areas, sporting events where the public is invited, band concerts, theater shows. There's a diminished expectation of privacy there, and so folks may be more vulnerable in those spaces. That's where it's important for us to provide opportunities for people to participate virtually so that they lower their risk of exposure. So we're going to touch briefly on places of worship and then talk about hospitals. And then I want to spend a little bit more time about talking about safety planning, considering who our audience is here today. So places of worship are, I would say, largely open to the public, but there are usually some spaces where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. So we've marked off like an office, or I don't know, growing up, like there were certain parts in the front of the church where I knew you didn't go. That was only where the priest went. And so there can be expectations of privacy even within these spaces that are largely open to the public. Just like in these other scenarios that we've talked about, judicial warrant or consent is required for ICE to access anything but those public areas. And so what's really important for places of worship to keep in mind at this point is to create a protocol, number one, for who has the authority to consent or the right to refuse entry, on that same flip side of the same coin, to enter those private areas such as the office or prep rooms or even parish housing. So as church leadership is thinking through, or places of worship are starting to think through what safety planning might look like, identifying kind of a hierarchy, and we're going to go through a sample plan and what that might look like in a minute, but that's one thing that you can do. Also, protocol, like if they don't have authority to be there, protocol for asking them to leave politely. Again, we never want to be aggressive. We never want to use force. And I got to be honest, like we talked about, you know, kind of the difference between someone flipping you the bird and giving you the thumbs down. Like I get enraged when someone flips me the bird and I'm driving in my car, but if someone gives me like a thumbs down, like, ooh, that was a bad choice, suddenly I feel real bad. And like, I'm going to go home and think about that, and feel ashamed. And so just thinking about kind of the psychology of that, like, acting in kindness, even if we're saying, I'm not giving you permission to enter, or I would like you to leave, please. Making sure that we continue to issue those requests kindly rather than becoming aggressive, it's going to change the behavior of the responding agent. And then communication with our congregants, letting them know that we have these policies and that you value their safety and their privacy, and that you're doing what you can within your authority and your ability to protect them and their privacy in this space. So hospitals, same kind of thing, both public and private spaces in hospitals. And same thing, I know I sound like a broken record, but they've got to have that judicial warrant or consent to enter private areas. And so this is where it becomes important, whether we're talking about a place of worship or a hospital, to clearly mark those public and private spaces. And then again, creating protocol for how to respond to ICE or CBP entering a hospital. And then an important note for patients. So for those of us in the audience who are chaplains and go into the hospital, it's important that you kind of understand that patients also do not have to give their immigration status to receive medical care, and they also have the same basic rights in the privacy of their medical room if ICE or CBP finds them in a medical care facility. So again, all of these opportunities for us to potentially advocate with this information. So let's talk about long-held traditions of sanctuary. Churches are for as long as I can imagine, have long been held out to be these safe spaces. The NPR just came out with an article, and I just want to read a little bit from it. They said, in the 1800s, U.S. churches gave safe harbor to enslaved people, and this was here in the United States. During the Vietnam War, they sheltered people resisting the military draft. Later in the article, they say a similar pattern spans back to the early years of Christianity, of churches offering people refuge. Really, this idea that we should show compassion and mercy to people who are vulnerable is so fundamental to any Christian, to our Christian values, to our Christian sacred texts, and really to all faith traditions, says the Reverend Noel Anderson, who is the National Field Director for the refugee support organization Church World Services. Like, these are fundamental to all walks of faith. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Christianity or something else. This is fundamental to what it is to be a group of faith, and this is fundamental to religious freedoms. Personally, as an attorney, I am waiting for churches to turn around and say, hey, wait a minute. The fact that you are coming into my space to conduct enforcement action is a violation of my religious freedoms. And let's see where that goes with this current Supreme Court. During the Mr. Trump's first administration, there were so many churches that provided sanctuary to immigrants. There were notable cases of people living in churches for up to 2 years to avoid deportation. There was a case in Arizona where a guy was there for a month. It's an important role, and there were so many churches during the first administration that were willing to kind of take the risk of offering sanctuary to these vulnerable populations to uphold these traditions of sanctuary. But it's not something that comes without risk. Churches are not untouchable. Concealing the whereabouts of an individual being sought by immigration authorities or aiding in their escape from those authorities can result in violating federal law against harboring undocumented immigrants. And then again, quoting that same NPR article, such practices were built upon century-old ideas that held that churches were sacred and protected spaces, and that a sanctuary could refer to a physical meeting space as well as to a concept of safety and refuge. And while sanctuary cities are a modern matter of contention, they're in the news. Apparently, the Department of Justice is investigating them. The Hebrew Bible lists 6 cities of refuge for people seeking refuge and includes the alien or sojourner among those who can seek refuge in the cities. So again, this is such a long-held tradition of the Christian church especially, but all, and this again is my own cultural framework. I grew up in a Christian church. But it was really only in the 20th century that the state, that the government started to move or to enter these sacred spaces at will, and that ended centuries of sanctuary and sanctity within these churches. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I wanted to go through that history and then also talk about those risks. I wanted to move on now and talk about what we can do to protect congregants in these places that are no longer considered sensitive locations. Again, that plan is really important. And this has been my work for the last 4 months, is making plans and helping people to face that scary monster. I have 2 daughters, and both of them have pretty severe anxiety at moments. And so one of the practices we have is whatever thing that is bothering them in the moment, we will look it in the face. We'll take it out of their brains, and we will look at it from all angles. And by examining that scary situation, or that, scary possibility, that scary outcome, and making plans for it, suddenly seems a lot less intimidating. There's a plan, or at least I know what are all the bad things that could happen if this does actually transpire. And the same thing goes when we're talking about our congregations, when we're talking about our schools, when we're talking about families in our community. We want to have a plan for that worst case scenario, rather than it just looming in the back of our minds, something that grows bigger and uglier and scarier the more it festers in our brain. Let's get it out. Let's get it on paper. Let's use some of those resources that a lot of our law offices have created, and start thinking through what information would I need to put on paper, or would I need to give to somebody, so that if I needed to reunite with my children, or if I needed to sell my house, or someone needed to take care of my pets, what would they need to know? And so same with our churches. We want to make a plan. Like, this may never happen to any of us. We may just be like overreacting and over planning, but as a control freak and hyper planner, I always prefer having a plan over not. And I sleep a lot better at night when I feel like I have at least a plan in place. And so it's important for places of worship that have just lost their sensitive locations designation to start thinking through what would a safety plan look like. So one piece of this, like I said, is clearly marking those public and private spaces. And this is something you can do this afternoon. Like, just print some pieces of paper. We've done the same thing at our office, and we've pasted them in the window of our door. Depending on the structure of your place of worship or faith-based organization, you can lock the door and use like the Ring doorbell system, where there's like a camera entry and people have to ring a door to enter. When I worked at the Diocese of Grand Rapids, everybody had to ring the doorbell to be let in. It didn't matter if they had a pre-existing appointment. Designate someone to review warrants. So we talked a lot about warrants. I can get some other resources to you if you want to have in hand kind of that visual distinction, so you know the difference. But have someone who can review those warrants and then make determinations about whether or not to give consent, or again, just say no consent. Like, I know I don't have an obligation to consent. I'm not going to consent. I don't care if you hand me like, a stack of warrants. I'm not going to help. Not helping is not the same as what we talked about earlier, where like you might be accused of harboring undocumented immigrants. Employees of places of worship or faith-based organizations should advise their congregants of their rights to remain silent if ICE or CBP ever does come to a place of worship. And then also important, don't flee, don't lie, you can record. And then I just put an extra note here too, that employees shouldn't lie. So let's say I just watched the Mask of Zorro, and there's a scene where, gosh, what's his name? Zorro. He steps into a confession box, and the priest is hiding his whereabouts. The guy comes in looking for him. And he says, I don't know where he is. And, he eventually like cuts his way out of the confession box and escapes. So like, that could be problematic. Like, you know, it's cute and funny in the context of this. Well, it wasn't very cute and funny because I think that priest ended up in the mines and he was doing manual labor. But there are consequences for, again, lying, obstructing justice, and like concealing the whereabouts of a congregant. So if you know, you just need to be smart about the way that you respond to that. If you do decide that you're going to be a sanctuary church and conceal their identity or their whereabouts. So let's go on real quick to a sample ICE safety plan. Our churches all look very different. Places of worship all look very different around here. Some have like a front office or vestibule that you enter, especially after hours. You have to go to the front office to talk to anyone. So that person should be advised to not give consent to enter, that they are following a protocol, and that they have to contact a designated person who is supposed to respond in these situations. So for folks who often are kind of like frontline responders, they're going to be the people like answering phones or answering the doors or letting people in. Those are the ones that you want to make sure are clear on what the protocol is, so that they don't like see police or don't see someone's like hand them a piece of paper that looks like a warrant and they're automatically, okay, come in, because that then is the consent that they needed to get in, even if they didn't have the valid warrant. So building administrators or whomever, maybe leadership, they, you know, especially if it's during like a worship service or a prayer service or something like that. One idea might be place the congregants on notice that ICE and CPP are present, and see if you can, you know, I don't know if you would like have kind of like a stay in place request, because you don't want everyone to panic and like run out. Again, safety needs to be the concern. And so like, you don't want to have like a trampling situation or a situation that's going to cause a congregant to run into some of these issues, such as like fleeing or lying or getting into a situation where they've then established that probable cause to make that arrest. Whoever this designated official is should notify ICE that they can't answer any questions about specific congregants without a judicial warrant, and that they don't give consent to entry. And then that person should also review the authority to conduct that search. So review that warrant, look at badges, and make a determination about whether or not it's appropriate for them to be in that space and if you want to comply. If they don't have a valid warrant, you can politely ask them to leave. Like, I know my rights. I know this is not a judicial warrant. This is a non-binding administrative warrant. I would like you to please leave. You don't have authority to be here. That's okay to say. In fact, that's great to say. And then if they still enter, the protocol should be to make sure that you've got some people on staff who are trained with this information that we just reviewed, and that they can then advise the congregants of their rights to remain silent, to ask for an attorney, and then say no more. And then just keep reminding them, don't lie, don't flee, don't present any false documents. So this is one kind of like abbreviated safety plan that you might put in place. But again, every place of worship is different. I trust faith leaders to know what's best for their congregation, and with your leadership, come up with a plan that makes the most sense for the folks you serve. Our office, on the subject of emergency planning or safety planning, we have a resource that we put out. And I know that other agencies like the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center have a similar resource. One thing about places of worship is you have a rapport with people that many of us do not. You know, Dilly and I, we do a lot to organize services and education, and we're kind of doing this top level trickle down of information thing, but we don't necessarily always have that rapport with the people who are going to need to do this work, who are going to need to put together a safety plan or get powers of attorney or get US passports for their children. And so our faith leaders are in a unique position to be able to help their congregants think through these really tough issues and start to put together these plans. So again, this is a resource that I would be happy to share with everyone at this meeting today. It's available on our website as well. But in this emergency plan, and there's a worksheet that helps people think through what information do I need to collect. So information about your children, their names, date of birth, do they have any medical conditions, what medications are they taking, what doctor do they see, what school do they go to, who's their teacher, what bus do they ride. Holy smokes, there's so much information that parents hold in their heads about kids, and we don't often think to record this somewhere. And so that would be really important for these mixed status families, especially who are in fear of separation or deportation. Pets. I have a dog. He's got anxiety. He needs to take anxiety pills every morning. I got another dog. Don't feed him green beans, he'll puke. These are things that would be nice for people to know. What about your home? Like, do you have a mortgage, and who holds your mortgage, and how does that get paid? Or are you a renter? Vehicles. So if someone gets deported, you may want to do a quitclaim deed for the house, or you may want to sell the house in a traditional way, or you may want to sell those vehicles and get that money then transferred to the family who was deported. And that's where these powers of attorney come into play. And powers of attorney are legal documents that give authority to someone else to act in your stead. So delegation of parental authority, this is for kids. You've got minor children. You want to make sure that if anything happens to you, someone else has been designated as caretaker. And so those powers of attorney are really important in those instances. Durable financial power of attorney. This is when you want to give someone permission to manage your assets and finances. So sell your home, sell your vehicles, transfer money, get into your bank accounts. And then that durable, or the delegation of parental authority, also helps with family reunification. So that allows that person to make travel arrangements, medical decisions, and educational decisions for that child. US passports are really important too to think about in this planning. So minor children should all who were born in this country, despite everything that's being said about birthright citizenship, still can get US passports. And it would be important to have that so that those kids can travel easily to reunite with parents who might have been deported. And then all of this stuff should be stored in a safe place. We have a checklist of documents that should be collected, as well as the worksheet of information, and then all of that should be put together in one place. It could be copied and given to the person who's been designated power of attorney for either finances or parental authority. But again, these are things that faith leaders are primed to help with, and we would love to see partnership in this initiative. Other things to talk about too that's really important, especially as places where people congregate in large groups, it creates risk. They become targets for enforcement action. So things that we can do to limit risk. One idea might be making available the worship service or the prayer service virtually so that people can sign in from the safety of their home. That way they don't need to get in a car, drive without a driver's license, putting them at risk, and then be in a public place where they're at risk of apprehension. Other things as faith leaders who are thinking through kind of like wraparound services, we're hearing a lot about access to food. So kids who ordinarily get at least 2 of their meals at school, but are now too afraid to go to school. We need to figure out how to get those meals to them until they feel safe to return. Grocery and pantry services. I'm actually talking to our local food club tomorrow and a couple of pantries about what can be done to safeguard those spaces. Advocates are anticipating that these nonprofit social service providers are going to be a target for enforcement action potentially. So what can we do to make sure that these people continue to get this vital service? Can we deliver their food? Can we have some sort of confidential list? And we know that these people who typically participate in this food club or come to pantry nights at the high school, like what can we do to get that food to them so that they don't have to put themselves at risk? Talked about virtual attendance options, carpooling, so that people who don't have driver's licenses aren't made to get behind a wheel of a car and drive and put themselves at risk. During the first Trump administration, we did see a lot of people who were stopped without a driver's license and then were placed in removal proceedings. So this is a very real threat. And then what else? So this list was geared more towards schools, but communicating that safety plan to your congregants. And then, I don't know, for like children's services at places of worship, I don't know if like there are like emergency cards that you keep on file, but like making sure that that's up to date, because I'm thinking through the situation that happened with the Quaker church. The guy was just sitting in the service. He was wearing an ankle tether. It went off. In order to not disturb the worship service, he left and then found ICE waiting outside. What would have happened in that instance if he had dropped the kid off at nursery before heading into the worship service? Suddenly he's picked up and then no one's there to pick up the kid. So making sure that we're thinking through that scenario for kids that are participating in those children's services at our places of worship. And then if there are any like, if your buildings are being used for like youth programming or after hours services, making sure that the facilitators of those programs are also aware of what the safety plan and protocol is really important too. So here I mentioned like Boys and Girls Club, but I like one popular thing here is Awana for young people. So just making sure that facilitators are all up to speed about what the church's plan is in these situations. Dilly, that's all I've got for information at this point. I was going to open it up for questions, so I don't know if you want to stop the recording.